Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere a little unexpected, the shores of 18th century Tahiti, a place where the British arrived with their mighty ship, scientific instruments, and a lot of nails. What followed wasn't a grand battle or treaty, but something far quieter, stranger, and more human. Nails traded for favors, misunderstandings that turned into new economies, and tiny exchanges that changed entire societies. So before we set sail, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slow, immersive journeys into history. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing this little community stretch across the globe. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift back to a world where a simple nail could reshape history. Arrival in a different world. The year was 1769, and the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before the wooden hull of HMS Endeavour. Commanded by Captain James Cook, the vessel had spent months traversing unfamiliar waters. Its mission combined the celestial with the imperial to observe the transit of Venus across the sun from a vantage point in the South Pacific, and then, less officially, to search for the mythical southern continent that European cartographers imagined must exist to balance the globe. As the ship approached Tahiti, an island unknown to most Europeans, the atmosphere aboard shifted. The sailors, many of whom had endured long periods of isolation, salted meat, and monotony, peered toward the green mountains and pale beaches with a mix of exhaustion and curiosity. For the Tahitians, this encounter would be equally unprecedented. Their world, structured by kinship, ritual exchange, and a relationship with the natural environment that Europeans barely understood, was about to experience a new and disorienting form of commerce. A floating world meets an island society. Tahiti in the 18th century was not a single political unit, but a patchwork of chiefdoms governed by high-ranking families. Hospitality was central to the island's culture. Visitors were offered food, shelter, and companionship, not as a transactional service, but as a ritual affirmation of status and generosity. In this system, gifts reinforced hierarchy and obligations. When the Endeavour anchored in Matavai Bay, Cook and his men entered into this web of ritual without fully grasping its subtleties. Initial interactions were cautious but warm. Joseph Banks, the wealthy botanist aboard, described in his journal the beauty and elegance of Tahitian canoes approaching the ship, their paddlers singing rhythmic chants. They brought fruits, pigs, chickens, and woven goods to trade. The British offered iron tools, nails, knives, and small hardware items. These were not insignificant trinkets. For a society without ironworking, such objects represented extraordinary utility. A single nail could be reshaped into a fishhook, chisel, or knife. Nails, from ship's hull to currency. At first, the British sailors traded what they could spare. Nails pulled from spare stores or pocket knives exchanged for coconuts or cooked pigs. But soon, an unintended economy developed. The women of Tahiti, as part of their society's customs, sometimes offered sexual companionship as part of hospitality or ritual alliance-making. For them, these exchanges were embedded in cultural logics of status and reciprocity. For the sailors, They were interpreted in the more transactional manner familiar to European port towns. The key turning point came when it was realized that iron nails, abundant on the ship but non-existent on the island, could be traded not only for food but for favors and companionship. A few nails could secure a night ashore. The ship's carpenters grew alarmed. Some sailors, driven by desire and boredom, began pulling nails out of the ship's own timbers. Hull planks loosened, beams creaked. In one recorded incident, a sailor was caught attempting to pry a nail from a deck beam in the dead of night. Captain Cook, who maintained a careful balance between strict discipline and pragmatic tolerance, quickly recognized the potential danger. A shortage of nails threatened not only the integrity of the ship, but the expedition itself. Without nails, masts could not be secured, hull breaches could not be patched, and repairs during the long voyage home would become impossible. Written observations, a meeting of misunderstandings. The journals of the Endeavour crew reveal a fascinating clash of perceptions. Joseph Banks recorded, almost clinically, the speed at which nails became current coin. He observed that the people would give anything for a nail, and noted how the common sailors bartered their very means of return. Another sailor wrote in his personal log that a man might live ashore in comfort if he possessed but a handful of nails. From the Tahitian perspective, these exchanges were not necessarily prostitution in the European sense. Sexual encounters were often tied to status, alliance building, or hospitality rituals. The introduction of a foreign material with immense practical value merely shifted the forms of exchange. In a society where prestige objects, fine cloth, feathers, or rare shells were used to solidify relationships, iron suddenly entered as a new kind of prestige object. This wasn't merely barter, it was cultural reinterpretation. Ritual, gender, and status. Women in Tahitian society held complex roles. While male chiefs dominated formal political leadership, women could exercise considerable influence in ritual, kinship alliances, and local economic networks. Some women were of high rank, and their interactions with foreigners carried political weight. Others were commoners who participated in hospitality exchanges as part of broader communal obligations. European observers, coming from a society that drew sharp distinctions between respectable women and prostitutes, interpreted these interactions through their own lens. They often reduced nuanced cultural practices to crude stereotypes. What was to Tahitians a ritual of welcome could, in the sailors' eyes, resemble a brothel. Escalation, the nail problem. The nail trade soon spiraled out of control. Cook noted increasing theft from the ship's stores, and the carpenters complained that the vessel's structure was literally being dismantled piece by piece. He ordered strict regulations on the handling of nails. No sailor was allowed to remove nails without authorization, and trade had to be supervised. Still, the allure was strong. Iron was power, and desire, after months at sea, was difficult to regulate. Tahitians, perceptive traders, quickly adapted. They began to prefer nails over other goods, even turning down cloth or trinkets in favor of this new, transformative material. Some accounts suggest that a sort of inflation occurred. As nails became more common through sailor theft, Tahitians raised their expectations, demanding more nails for the same exchanges. An accidental economy had formed, a market built on desire, misunderstanding, and iron. Water waved the broader imperial context. This seemingly trivial episode is a window into a larger phenomenon. Across the Pacific, European explorers brought with them technological asymmetries, iron tools, guns, textiles, which they traded with societies that valued entirely different goods. These trades often had unexpected consequences. In some cases, they destabilized local power hierarchies. In others, they introduced dependencies on foreign goods that would later shape colonial encounters. For the British, nails were small, replaceable objects. For the Tahitians, they were revolutionary. A single iron nail could save hours of labor in crafting tools from bone or shell. It represented an entirely new material technology, one that could reshape fishing, construction, and warfare. What began as a sailor's indulgence would ripple through Tahitian society long after the Endeavour had departed at a moment of pause. As you picture the Endeavour rocking gently in Matavai Bay under the southern stars, think of the quiet creaking of the hull as nails disappeared from its planks. Think of the flickering torchlight along the beach, where sailors and islanders exchanged glances, goods, and gestures whose meanings neither side fully shared. This was not a grand battle or treaty signing, but a slow, mundane exchange, nails for hospitality, that would shape the history of cultural contact. And yet, behind this seemingly simple trade lies a question. What happens when two societies assign radically different meanings to the same object? An economy of desire and iron. The days following the arrival of HMS Endeavour saw Matavai Bay transform from a tranquil lagoon into a buzzing site of constant interaction. Canoes crisscrossed the water, laden with food, woven mats, pigs, and curious onlookers. On the shore, Tahitian families gathered near the encampments the British had established for their astronomical observations. A kind of temporary marketplace emerged, though it was not a market in the European sense of stalls and coinage. Rather, it was a fluid network of personal exchanges, each governed by expectations, status, and evolving curiosity. As nails circulated through these exchanges, their meaning deepened. What had started as simple bartering between individuals began to take on broader social and political dimensions. Iron, previously unknown on the island, now moved through Tahitian society like a new kind of manna, a substance imbued with transformative power. Chiefs took notice, families adapted, and the British found themselves navigating a cultural and economic dynamic they neither planned nor fully controlled: the nail supply crisis. Inside the Endeavour, the situation was becoming serious. Nails were not decorative objects. They were the very skeleton of the ship. Each nail pried loose weakened the structural integrity that held the Endeavour together against storms, currents, and reefs. William Perry, the ship's master carpenter, recorded in his journal his growing alarm. The seamen, in pursuit of their lust, have made free with the ship's fastenings, taking nails from beams and knees. I have remonstrated with them, but they do persist, thinking only of the pleasures ashore. Cook recognized the urgency. If left unchecked, the ship could become unseaworthy. He convened officers and ordered a strict accounting of all iron supplies. Nail theft was now punishable, not just as petty theft, but as a serious act endangering the entire crew. Sentries were posted near the carpenter's stores, and nighttime inspections increased. But the sailors were inventive. Some filed down larger iron spikes into nail-sized pieces. Others smuggled nails in the folds of clothing or hollowed out small spaces in their hammocks. The black market aboard the ship flourished quietly, driven by desire and the intoxicating possibility of life ashore in comfort. Tahitian adaptation, chiefs, and iron. On shore, Tahitian chiefs, known as REI, watched this influx of iron closely. These leaders controlled large networks of kinship and resource distribution. When valuable goods entered their society, chiefs typically managed their flow, distributing them to reinforce loyalty and hierarchy. Iron was a game changer. A single nail could be reshaped into fish hooks far superior to traditional bone or shell ones. It could become a tool for carving canoes, building houses, or fashioning ornaments of unprecedented prestige. Chiefs began collecting nails through their kin and through direct negotiations with the British officers. Some chiefs instructed women in their extended households to engage with sailors strategically, using social rituals to draw iron into their domain. The British did not perceive this as political maneuvering. To them, it seemed like spontaneous fraternization. But in Tahitian terms, this was resource diplomacy. Chiefs competed subtly for relationships with the foreigners. Who controlled the flow of nails controlled a new axis of power. Ritual hospitality versus transaction. From the Tahitian point of view, the presence of foreign men was woven into existing frameworks of ritual hospitality. Visiting groups from other islands or chiefdoms were traditionally welcomed with food, feasting, and often sexual hospitality, acts that affirmed bonds and could lead to alliances or exchanges of goods. The arrival of the Endeavour was simply this pattern magnified. For the British, however, their worldview was shaped by port towns, where sexual encounters were usually commercial. When Tahitian women offered companionship, sailors naturally interpreted these as prostitution, and nails became the price. Neither side was entirely wrong within their own cultural logic, but the result was a profound misalignment of meanings. What Tahitians saw as hospitality and alliance building, the British saw as individual transactions. And so nails became both currency and misunderstanding simultaneously, journals and observations. The ship's naturalist Joseph Banks, ever the meticulous chronicler, noted how quickly iron became the universal medium of traffic. He recorded scenes that, while described calmly, reveal the layered complexity. The people brought their goods to our tents daily. Nails were preferred above all else. A few inches of iron procured a pig, a larger nail, the company of a woman. Some of our men, having exhausted their supply, set themselves to removing nails from the very vessel, to the great disquiet of our carpenters. Banks also observed how Tahitians seemed to measure the quality and size of nails, developing an intuitive price scale. Long, thick nails commanded more valuable exchanges than short, thin ones. In essence, a market rate emerged organically, negotiated through hundreds of small interactions, astronomical observations amidst chaos. Amid this swirl of cultural exchange, the primary mission continued: Observing the transit of Venus on June 3, 1769, Cook and his officers had established a fortified observatory onshore to record the event with precision. This required calm, cooperation, and logistical stability. Yet, as the day approached, disciplinary issues aboard the ship multiplied. Sailors frequently overstayed their shore leave, some attempting to desert altogether. A few were caught hiding in Tahitian houses, hoping to remain permanently on the island. For sailors who had endured cramped quarters, harsh discipline, and months at sea, Tahiti appeared a paradise. Abundant food, warm climate, and social structures that seemed, at least superficially, far more permissive than those of Europe. Cook responded with measured severity. He needed discipline, but also needed cooperation with the Tahitians. Floggings for nail theft and desertion were carried out publicly to set an example, but he avoided excessive cruelty that might offend the chiefs. This balancing act was delicate. Any perceived insult could disrupt the fragile alliance that allowed the Endeavor's mission to continue at an emerging iron hierarchy. Within Tahitian society, nails began circulating beyond immediate encounters with sailors. Chiefs redistributed them to loyal families. Skilled craftsmen began experimenting with reshaping iron, creating tools and ornaments. Some nails were even ritually buried or offered, indicating their perceived spiritual potency. Iron was rare and transformative enough to alter local hierarchies. Families with better access to nails gained prestige. Chiefs who secured more iron consolidated power. The nail trade thus had social consequences far beyond the beachside exchanges that initiated it. It's notable that the British, preoccupied with their own needs, largely failed to grasp the extent of this ripple effect. They saw nails as small items, of limited value compared to guns or cloth. But for Tahitians, iron entered as a foundational technology, a tool-making material that could reshape daily life. Individual stories, the sailor and the Tahitian household. Among the Endeavor's crew, a few sailors formed personal relationships with Tahitian families. One such sailor, recorded in journals under the pseudonym J, became closely associated with a household near the shore. He provided nails and other small items, and in return was given food, companionship, and even a place to sleep. Over weeks, he became embedded in the rhythm of daily life. Fishing, repairing canoes, helping gather breadfruit. This wasn't an isolated incident. Several sailors developed temporary quasi-domestic arrangements. Though the British command discouraged such entanglements, they couldn't fully prevent them. For the Tahitian families, these relationships were opportunities, socially and materially valuable. For the sailors, they represented a brief escape from the rigid hierarchy of the ship. Yet these arrangements were fragile. When the Endeavor eventually prepared to leave, sailors were forced back aboard, sometimes under guard, leaving behind households that had, however briefly, incorporated them. Regulation attempts. Recognizing the scale of nail trading, Cook issued formal trade regulations. All barter had to go through designated officers. Nails were to be traded only in specific quantities. Sailors were forbidden from independent trading. The intention was to protect the ship's structure and prevent social disorder. But these rules clashed with the informal, person-to-person nature of Tahitian hospitality. Trade could not be centralized because the encounters themselves were decentralized, in homes, on beaches, in canoes at night. Iron moved in quiet conversations, not just in daylight exchanges overseen by officers. The more Cook tried to regulate, the more inventive the sailors became. Some hid nails in the seams of their clothing. Others flattened small iron scraps to mimic nail shapes. A few collaborated with Tahitians to conceal traded goods in coastal caves or buried caches to be retrieved later. Broader patterns of Pacific contact. The nail trade at Matavai Bay was not unique. Similar patterns appeared throughout early European encounters in the Pacific. In Hawaii, later voyages would see iron tools become powerful political currency. In New Zealand, iron blades transformed Maori warfare and agriculture. Across the region, small technological objects from Europe, often undervalued by the Europeans themselves, entered indigenous societies as prestige goods and strategic resources. This underscores a key dynamic of early imperial encounters: asymmetry of perception. Europeans saw these exchanges as trivial or opportunistic. Islanders saw them as opportunities to reshape social power structures using new materials, the nail trade as cultural mirror. By mid-June 1769, the nail trade had become so entrenched that neither side could easily stop it. The Endeavour's hull had been inspected and partially repaired to replace stolen nails. Tahitian chiefs had accumulated iron that would circulate for years. Sailors had experienced brief but intense relationships that many would remember long after they returned to Europe. What seemed like a small, even humorous episode, the trading of nails for favors, was in fact a microcosm of cultural encounter. It reflected how desires, technologies, and misunderstandings could combine to create entirely new forms of exchange. And yet, amidst this bustling and often chaotic scene, a lingering question emerged among some officers and observers. What long-term changes would these handfuls of nails set in motion within Tahitian society once the Endeavour was gone? Departure, ripples, and long shadows. By late June of 1769, the British expedition's official purpose in Tahiti had been achieved. The transit of Venus had been observed with care, notes taken, sketches made, and measurements logged for the Royal Society. The Endeavour had anchored in Matavai Bay for 3 months, longer than in most other ports of the voyage. What began as a scientific mission had evolved into a complex web of personal relationships, economic shifts, and cultural entanglements, all revolving, unexpectedly, around the humble iron nail. As preparations to depart began in earnest, Cook and his officers faced a situation very different from their arrival. The sailors had developed attachments. Tahitian chiefs had integrated iron into their power networks, and the nail trade had subtly altered both shipboard discipline and island society. The moment of departure would bring all these threads to the surface. Preparations to leave, securing the hull. Before the Endeavour could set sail again, its hull and fittings required careful inspection. Weeks of clandestine nail removal had left the ship's structure compromised. Carpenters worked long hours to hammer in replacement nails, reinforce beams, and seal gaps. Cook, meticulous as ever, ordered repeated inspections, unwilling to risk the long Pacific leg ahead with a weakened vessel. Journals from the crew note a stern mood aboard the ship. What had been a season of discovery and indulgence was ending. Sailors, once eager to trade nails for companionship, now faced tight restrictions. The officers counted every nail and piece of iron. Some nails had to be reforged from spare anchors and metal fittings to replace what had been stolen. Even so, the carpenters remained uneasy. They could not guarantee that all structural weaknesses had been found. On shore, Tahitians watched these preparations with curiosity. They understood that the British would soon leave, but the iron would remain. For many, this was the first time their society had encountered a technology that arrived suddenly, changed daily life, and then disappeared with its source. The chiefs, ever strategic, focused on consolidating what iron they had gathered, distributing some to allies, and storing the rest for future use. The desertion attempts. Departure also triggered emotional tensions. Several sailors, deeply entwined with Tahitian households, attempted to desert. For them, Tahiti represented something radically different from their lives in Britain. Warm weather, abundant food, fewer hierarchies, and a rhythm of life that felt, at least superficially, more humane. One sailor, whose case was recorded in multiple journals, hid in a Tahitian village for several days before being discovered. The search involved both British Marines and Tahitian chiefs, who, after negotiations, handed him over. His punishment was public flogging, meant to deter others. But behind the discipline lay a more human story. During his time ashore, he had been integrated into a household, participating in daily fishing expeditions and even receiving tattoos, a sign of belonging. Other sailors were found in similar situations. Some begged to stay. Cook, firm in discipline, refused every plea. He was not merely concerned about manpower. Allowing sailors to desert would undermine British authority in the eyes of Tahitian chiefs, suggesting weakness or lack of control. For the Tahitians involved, these desertion episodes were equally complex. Some families had come to value the presence of individual sailors, not just for nails, but for companionship, tools, or the novelty of their skills. The forced removal of these men created small social disruptions, the echoes of which are hard to trace but undoubtedly real. Tahitian iron circulation, from novelty to necessity. By the time of departure, the nail economy had matured in subtle ways. At first, nails were curiosities, strange, hard objects with remarkable utility. Within months, Tahitians had adapted to their presence. Iron tools began to replace bone and shell in certain tasks. Fishing hooks were sharper and more durable. Woodworking became easier. Chiefs used nails to enhance ceremonial offerings or to reinforce their political alliances. The British did not stay long enough to witness the long-term effects, but anthropologists and later explorers would note that the iron introduced by Cook's expedition persisted for years in Tahitian society. It circulated through kinship networks, was reshaped by local craftsmen, and became woven into cultural practices. What makes this development fascinating is its accidental nature. Cook had not set out to introduce a new economic medium to Tahiti. The Royal Society was interested in planetary motions, not the microeconomics of nails. Yet the encounter between two societies produced an outcome neither intended. The integration of iron into Tahitian culture through everyday exchanges rather than formal treaties or colonial conquest. Cook's reflections and regulations. Cook's journal entries in the final weeks on Tahiti reveal a man trying to impose order on a situation that had evolved beyond his control. He wrote, "Great care must be taken in all future voyages to secure the ship's stores and prevent the sailors from trafficking with the natives in such a manner as may endanger the safety of the vessel." This line would become a guiding principle for later voyages. European captains learned from Cook's experience, taking stricter precautions to prevent nail theft and unauthorized trade. Ironically, the nail problem became part of naval administrative lore, influencing how future explorers approached Pacific societies. Banks, too, reflected on the cultural implications. Though he often wrote with the detached tone of a naturalist, he observed how swiftly Tahitians adapted to iron, noting that they know its value better than many among our lower class. He admired their skill in reshaping nails into tools, acknowledging that the supposed primitive society showed remarkable ingenuity, personal encounters, and cultural imprints. Among the Endeavour's crew, personal memories of Tahiti varied. Some sailors left with tattoos, a striking novelty in Britain at the time. Others carried small woven mats, shells, or wooden carvings given by their Tahitian hosts. A few carried emotional attachments they would speak of years later in taverns or journals. For Tahitians, the imprint was more material. Iron remained, altering daily routines in subtle but lasting ways. A nail used to make a fishing hook might catch hundreds of fish over its lifetime. An iron chisel might shape canoes more efficiently for years. These objects outlived the individuals who traded them. It is important to note that Tahitian society was not passively transformed by foreign influence. Rather, Tahitians actively integrated and reinterpreted iron within their existing frameworks. Just as they had long traded with neighboring islands, incorporating new goods into their social economy, they now applied the same logic to iron. The result was neither purely European nor purely Tahitian, but something new: unintended strategic consequences. Iron's introduction also had potential strategic consequences. In Tahiti's complex network of chiefdoms, power often rested on control of prestige goods, feathers, cloth, ornaments. Iron added a new layer to this competition. Chiefs who had cultivated strong relationships with Cook's crew possessed a disproportionate share of iron. This gave them advantages in fishing, construction, and ceremonial exchange. Later historical analyses suggest that this early iron distribution amplified existing hierarchies. Those already powerful became more so. Those distant from Matavai Bay, or without close ties to chiefs involved in the trade, had less access. A single 3-month encounter, driven by sailors trading nails for companionship, may have shifted power balances among Tahitian groups for years afterward. A broader pattern across the Pacific. The Endeavour's nail trade was not an isolated incident. It was an early example of a recurring pattern in Pacific encounters. Across Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, European contact introduced small, portable technologies, iron, cloth, beads, firearms, that became embedded in local economies in unexpected ways. In many places, iron tools spread before sustained colonial presence, traveling through indigenous trade networks far beyond the reach of European ships. A nail traded in Matavai Bay might eventually find its way, through chains of exchange, to distant islands Cook never visited. These objects became agents of cultural change, not because Europeans imposed them, but because local societies saw their utility and value. Departure, a quiet ending to a profound encounter. When the Endeavour finally raised anchor in July 1769, the scene was both orderly and subdued. The crew assembled, the sails unfurled, and the ship slowly pulled away from the shore. Canoes followed briefly, with Tahitians waving, shouting farewells, or offering last-minute gifts and requests. Some sailors lingered at the railings, staring back at the island they had come to think of, at least briefly, as a kind of earthly paradise. The chiefs stood on the beaches, irons safely stored. Women who had formed connections with sailors returned to their communities, perhaps richer in goods, perhaps changed in ways that were less tangible. The bay grew smaller, the mountains receded, and soon the Endeavour was once again alone on the Pacific, its crew bound for New Zealand. Behind them, though, they left more than footprints. They left an economy transformed, relationships forged and severed, and a new substance circulating through Tahitian society that a legacy in iron. Decades later, when missionaries and colonists arrived in Tahiti in greater numbers, they found a society already familiar with iron, already skilled at reshaping and repurposing it. Cook's nails had been absorbed into local technology, easing later exchanges and interactions. What had started as a disciplinary headache for the Endeavour's carpenters had, in effect, opened a door to new forms of material culture. Historians now view this episode not as a curious footnote, but as a key moment in the entanglement of European and Polynesian worlds. It demonstrates how small objects can catalyze large historical processes, especially when their meanings differ across cultures. Night falls on the empty waters where the Endeavour once anchored. Imagine the quiet beaches of Tahiti lit by fires, where iron nails are being hammered, bent, filed, and transformed into tools. The ship is gone, but its legacy remains, in the hands of fishermen, in the stores of chiefs, in the memories of families who hosted strangers from across the sea. And so, a final question lingers as the waves erase the last traces of Cook's anchorage. How many great historical shifts begin not with grand speeches or battles, but with the quiet exchange of small, ordinary objects? Echoes through time. The long history of a small exchange. The departure of the HMS Endeavour from Matavai Bay in July 1769 might have seemed, at the time, like the end of a brief, curious episode. A ship came, scientific observations were made, a few months of interaction passed, and then the ship sailed away into the blue Pacific. But history often hides its most significant moments in the quiet ripples that follow ordinary acts. What took place on those beaches and aboard that ship was not a treaty, not a conquest, not a battle. It was a series of small, human exchanges. Nails for food, nails for hospitality, nails for favors. Yet these interactions would leave traces that stretched far beyond the immediate encounter. In Tahitian society, in British naval practice, in the anthropology of cultural contact, And in the subtle ways global history is built out of countless small decisions, the material legacy, nails as technology. To understand the long-term impact of the nail trade, one must start with the material properties of iron itself. In a society without iron metallurgy, nails were not disposable fasteners. They were versatile raw materials. A single nail could be reshaped into fishing hooks, sharper and more durable than any made of bone or shell, improving catch yields. Chisels for carving wood, particularly valuable in canoe building and house construction. Adzes and blades, small but effective tools for everyday tasks. Ornaments, polished and worn as status symbols. Iron introduced new efficiencies into daily life. Canoes could be built or repaired more quickly. Fishing became more productive, potentially affecting local food distribution. The adoption of iron didn't happen overnight, but once introduced, it was irreversible. Archaeological and ethnographic studies conducted in the 19th and 20th centuries have confirmed that iron objects from Cook's expedition remained in circulation for decades. Some were even reworked multiple times. A nail turned into a hook, then later flattened into a blade, then perhaps used ceremonially. The material outlived the initial encounter, passing through many hands, slowly becoming woven into the island's fabric. Social and political ripples. The arrival of nails also amplified existing power structures within Tahitian society. Chiefs, REI, who had secured closer relations with Cook's officers and sailors, accumulated larger stocks of iron. This gave them political leverage. For example, chiefs could distribute iron to reward loyalty, strengthening kinship bonds. Access to iron tools allowed for more efficient construction of canoes and meeting houses, showcasing power and wealth. Ceremonial exchanges, essential in maintaining alliances between different clans and chiefdoms, now featured iron alongside traditional prestige goods like feathers and fine cloth. The unintended result was a subtle technological stratification. Some groups, particularly those near Matavai Bay, became early adopters of iron, while others remained reliant on traditional tools until later European visits. This uneven distribution of new technology shifted local balances of power in ways that even Cook could not have imagined. It is striking to consider. A sailor pulling a nail from the ship's hull in the dead of night was not merely endangering a plank. He was, in a sense, reshaping Tahitian political history, one nail at a time. Cook's experience and its influence on later voyages. For the British, the nail trade became a lesson in imperial logistics. In later Pacific voyages, by Cook himself and others, ships were outfitted with special trade goods specifically for exchanges with islanders. Nails, knives, beads, and cloth were brought in larger, controlled quantities. Strict rules were enforced to prevent sailors from dismantling ships for trade. Cook's later voyages to Hawaii and New Zealand show clear evidence of policy changes. Iron was used strategically, often given as gifts to chiefs or traded in a more controlled manner. This shift reflects how even small logistical problems could shape broader imperial practices. In naval archives and correspondence, the nail issue is mentioned repeatedly. It entered the bureaucratic memory of the Royal Navy, a cautionary tale about what happens when curiosity, desire, and technology meet in unplanned ways. Tahiti and the expanding world. When Cook returned to Tahiti on his second voyage in 1773, he found a society already familiar with iron. The goods from the Endeavour had circulated widely. Islanders recognized the value of iron tools, driving harder bargains and expecting more from trade. Some chiefs strategically positioned themselves to control interactions with the British, showing that the first encounter had not faded from memory. It had been absorbed and reinterpreted. By the time missionaries and traders began arriving in greater numbers decades later, they encountered a Tahitian society that was not untouched but already changed, incrementally, materially, and politically. The nail trade had been one of the earliest vectors of that change. Historians' perspectives, a microhistory. Modern historians often use this episode as a case study in microhistory, the idea that large historical forces can be best understood by examining small, specific events in great detail. The nail trade was not grand in scale, but it reveals how technological asymmetries drive cultural exchange, how misunderstandings between cultures can create entirely new systems of value, how ordinary individuals, sailors, women, craftsmen, shape history through daily choices. In this story, there are no famous battles or declarations, but rather a network of small interactions, each laden with meaning. Every nail traded was part of a chain reaction that connected an English dockyard to a Tahitian beach, a sailor's boredom to a chief's prestige, a carpenter's worry to a future political hierarchy, the emotional undercurrents. It is easy to view this story in purely economic or technological terms, but beneath the surface were human emotions, curiosity, desire, amusement, confusion, attachment. Sailors who had endured long, monotonous voyages found in Tahiti a world that felt like an escape, however temporary. Tahitian hosts encountered people whose objects and customs fascinated them, and they adapted swiftly, not as passive recipients, but as active participants. Chiefs navigated strategic opportunities, seeing in nails not just tools, but instruments of power. Cook himself wrestled with the discipline of his crew, the scientific goals of his mission, and the unplanned consequences of human nature. These undercurrents remind us that history is not merely a sequence of material exchanges. It is lived and felt by individuals, whose actions leave ripples that outlast their intentions. The broader historical significance. The Tahitian nail trade is part of a larger story. The encounter between European maritime empires and Pacific island societies. These encounters were often characterized not by conquest, but by exchange of goods, technologies, stories, and sometimes diseases. In this case, the exchange was relatively peaceful, mutual, and transformative for both sides. For the British, it offered insights into the adaptability and sophistication of Polynesian societies. For Tahitians, it introduced a material that would quietly reshape aspects of daily life and politics that it also foreshadowed future encounters. The next century would see more sustained European presence, missionary activity, and eventually colonial entanglements. But at this early stage, history moved not through proclamations, but through small-scale interactions, one nail at a time. Picture, for a moment, a quiet Tahitian evening months after the Endeavor's departure. A fisherman sits by a fire, carefully bending a piece of iron, a nail traded by some unknown sailor, into a fishhook. Children watch, fascinated by the ease with which the metal takes shape compared to bone. A chief oversees preparations for a ceremony, displaying a chisel made from a nail as a token of status. These scenes are ordinary, and yet they are the real theater of historical change. No one involved at the time could have foreseen how this mundane object, born in a distant forge in England, would alter social dynamics thousands of miles away. There was no fanfare, no declaration, just quiet acts of trade, curiosity, and adaptation. And so, the story ends not with a grand historical crescendo, but with a gentle question that lingers like the fading sound of waves against the hull of a ship. How many turning points in history happen not through intention, but through the quiet, unintended consequences of everyday exchanges?